Rain falls over Wayne Manor tonight. The kind of steady rain that has no interest in stopping. It taps against the tall windows in the east wing, traces slow lines down the glass, and disappears into the dark gardens below. Somewhere beyond the hedges, thunder rolls quietly, more memory than warning, fading before it ever fully arrives. Batman returns from patrol a little after 2 in the morning. The cave welcomes him the way it always does, not with light, but with sound. The distant waterfall beneath the manor continues its endless conversation with the stone, indifferent to the hour, indifferent to the weight the man beneath the cowl carries tonight. Water finds its way through rock, the same way memory finds its way through a tired mind. Quietly, persistently, without asking permission. He does not walk toward the Bat computer. Its monitors remain dark, patient, waiting the way old machines wait, without impatience, without need. Instead, Bruce walks past the trophy cases, past the towering shape of the bat plane resting in shadow, past the glass cabinet holding a certain oversized penny and a moth-eaten circus poster that still, after all these years, he has never been able to throw away. He walks toward the vault. It sits in the deepest section of the cave, behind a wall of rock that looks, to any untrained eye, like nothing more than stone. But Bruce built this wall himself, stone by stone, decision by decision. Behind it lies a security system with 7 separate locks: biometric, seismic, thermal, 3 of them known only to him, and one that requires something no machine has ever been able to replicate: patience. The first lock recognizes his heartbeat, and it takes several long seconds to confirm it is calm enough to proceed. The second reads the frequency of his voice, murmuring words too soft for any recorder to have ever captured. The third requires a key that exists nowhere in digital memory, a small brass shape, worn smooth by years of handling, that Bruce keeps sewn into the lining of his utility belt, exactly where his father once kept his pocket watch. One by one, the locks release. The vault door, thick, cold, ancient in feeling despite being younger than the cave itself, slides open with a low mechanical groan that echoes once through the chamber and fades into silence. Dust drifts gently in the pale light, disturbed for the first time in longer than Bruce cares to admit. Inside, shelves of folders rest in careful order. Case files on Ra's al Ghul, contingencies for the Justice League, each labeled with quiet, clinical precision. Files on villains long since defeated, and villains who never truly can be. Files on friends, too, because in Bruce's world, even friendship requires preparation. But there is one folder that sits apart from all the others. It rests on its own small shelf, slightly elevated, as though even the cave itself understands that this file deserves to be treated differently. It is black, leather-bound, worn soft at the corners from handling that happened long ago and never again since. There is no label, no case number, no date, only a symbol pressed faintly into the leather. A shield, an S, though Bruce has never once called it that. To him, it has always been something older, something that means hope in a language spoken light years from here. The House of El. Bruce stands in front of it for a long moment, unmoving. The rain continues above him, unseen, unheard here in the deep stone quiet. but felt somehow all the same. A pressure in the air, the feeling of a world going on without him, while he stands still. He reaches out. His glove brushes the edge of the folder. He hesitates. This is not the file of his greatest victory. He has never once thought of it that way. Not on the night it was completed. Not in any of the quiet years since. This is not a trophy. It is not proof of anything he wishes to remember with pride. It is a confession. The plan he built for the one person in his life he never wanted to need it for. The plan he hoped, more than any other plan he has ever constructed in this cave, would spend eternity gathering dust, untouched, untouched, forgotten, forgotten. Tonight, for reasons he cannot fully explain even to himself, he needs to remember why he built it anyway. He lifts the folder from the shelf. It is lighter than he remembers. Paper always is, in the end, lighter than the burden it carries. Bruce turns, walks back through the vault door, and settles into the old leather chair beside the Bat computer, its surface worn from decades of quiet nights just like this one. He sets the folder down. The desk lamp above him hums softly to life, spilling gold light across black leather. He opens the cover. The first page is not about powers. It is not about weaknesses. It is not about kryptonite or solar radiation or the outer limits of physics. The first page is about a man named Clark. Long before Batman ever considered how to stop Superman, Bruce Wayne spent months simply trying to understand Clark Kent. It began, as so many of Bruce's investigations do, with something small. A newspaper column. A byline in the Daily Planet, unremarkable at first glance. A story about a housing dispute in a forgotten metropolis neighborhood, written with more patience and care than the subject seemed to warrant. Bruce noticed the care before he noticed anything else. Most people, when they finally learn who is behind the cape and who is behind the glasses, expect Batman's file on Superman to begin with an explosion, a battlefield, a moment of danger that demanded urgent study. It does not. The first entry is dated years before Bruce ever imagined the two of them would stand across from each other with anything but trust between them. The page reads simply, "Subject shows unusual restraint in interviews, avoids credit, redirects praise toward others. Worth understanding why." Bruce had learned, over many years of solitary work, that abilities tell you what a person can do, but values tell you what they will do. And it is the second question that determines whether someone becomes a hero or a catastrophe. So, before he mapped Superman's strength, before he calculated the ceiling of his speed, Bruce studied Clark's habits. He noted the diner Clark preferred on Fridays, not because it mattered tactically, but because a person who returns to the same worn booth every week, greeting the same tired waitress by name, reveals something about the shape of his heart. He noted that Clark tipped generously, even when his own finances, by any measure, did not comfortably allow it. He noted that Clark rarely spoke about his own achievements, and when forced to, seemed almost uncomfortable doing so. Bruce built a private theory, one he never wrote down in full because some truths are safer left unwritten, even from oneself. That Clark Kent was not a disguise Superman wore to move safely among humans. Clark Kent was the truth. Superman was the amplification of it. This distinction mattered more than any calculation of force or velocity ever could. Because if Superman had been the truth and Clark the disguise, Bruce's contingency file would have needed to focus entirely on physical countermeasures. Walls thick enough, weapons precise enough, environments controlled enough to neutralize an overwhelming threat. But if Clark was the truth, then the greatest safeguard against Superman was never going to be a wall or a weapon. It would be Clark himself. Bruce spent long nights compiling smaller observations most investigators would have dismissed as irrelevant. The way Clark always let Lois finish her sentences, even when he clearly already understood where she was heading. The way he apologized to inanimate objects when he bumped into them, an old habit from a childhood spent learning, painfully, that his body did not follow the same rules as everyone else's. The way his eyes, according to 3 separate photographs Bruce examined under magnification, softened very slightly whenever children were nearby. Not performative kindness, but something instinctive, something that could not be manufactured for cameras. Bruce wrote, in careful handwriting near the bottom of an early page, "Clark Kent does not perform goodness. He simply has never learned another way to exist. This will either be humanity's greatest fortune or its greatest vulnerability, depending entirely on what the world does to him." It is, Bruce reflects now, turning the yellowed page beneath the desk lamp's glow, one of the truest things he has ever written. Understanding a person, Bruce had come to believe, long before he ever wore the cowl, requires more patience than understanding a weapon. Weapons are consistent. They follow. Physics. A person follows something far less predictable: history, fear, hope, grief, love. Bruce had spent his entire life becoming an expert in exactly that kind of unpredictable architecture, because his own father had died to it, and his own soul had been rebuilt from its wreckage. So when the question eventually arrived, what would it take to stop Superman? Bruce did not begin with strength. He began with character. Because the man beneath the symbol, he had come to understand, would always be more important than the symbol itself. It would take years before Bruce needed to test that belief. But the foundation of everything that followed, every calculation, every contingency, every quiet, terrible page still waiting further into this folder, rested on the study of one man's kindness. Not his powers, his heart. The second section of the file begins with numbers, and the numbers, Bruce remembers clearly, nearly stopped him from continuing at all. He had approached the problem the way he approached every problem, methodically, exhaustively, refusing to let emotion cloud a single variable. He listed what he knew: Superman's strength, capable of altering the course of falling buildings, of holding back forces that should, by any reasonable measure, crush a human body into dust. His speed, fast enough to have been clocked on rare recorded occasions, moving faster than sound itself. His senses, vision that could see through solid steel, hearing sensitive enough to isolate a single heartbeat from within a city of 8 million others. Bruce remembers sitting exactly where he sits now, years ago, staring at a single sheet of paper with a question written across the top in his own handwriting. If this being ever chose to stop protecting the world and instead chose to control it, what would be required to stop him? The honest answer, calculated across weeks of research, consultation of classified metallurgical data, projected energy outputs, and known physiological limits, was almost unbearable in its simplicity. Nothing on Earth was guaranteed to work. Bruce recalls the particular quality of silence that filled the cave the night he accepted that conclusion. Not panic. He had trained panic out of himself long ago, the same way a surgeon trains their hands not to tremble. But something quieter, heavier. A kind of grief for a solution that did not yet exist. Most men, Faced with an unsolvable problem, either abandon it or become consumed by it. Bruce did neither. He became curious. It is, he thinks now, running a gloved finger along the edge of a data printout gone brittle with age, one of the strangest truths about how his mind works. Where other people find despair in impossibility, Bruce has always found invitation. An impossible problem is simply a problem no one has broken down into small enough pieces yet. So he broke it down. He stopped asking, "How do I overpower Superman?" because that question had no honest answer. Instead, he began asking smaller, stranger questions. What conditions would ever cause Superman to hold back? What environments could limit, even briefly, his advantages? What psychological state would slow his reactions by even a fraction of a second? Because against someone capable of moving at the edge of perception, a fraction of a second was the only currency that mattered. He studied Kryptonian physiology using every fragment of data available. Samples recovered from the wreckage of the ship that first carried Clark to Earth, corroborated later by careful, quiet consultation with Clark's own Kryptonian archives, accessed only with permission Bruce sought with unusual formality. A request Clark granted without hesitation and, Bruce suspected even then, without fully understanding why it was being asked. He learned that Superman's powers were not, in fact, boundless. They were the result of exposure to Earth's yellow sun, absorbed and stored within his cells like sunlight gathered by a plant. Remove the sun, or replace it with something else, and the power would fade. Not instantly, but gradually, predictably, following patterns Bruce could calculate. This discovery did not make Bruce feel triumphant. He remembers that clearly. It made him feel something closer to sorrow, because it meant Superman's strength, however vast, was not eternal. It was borrowed. Every day Clark Kent walked beneath the yellow sun. He was, in the most literal sense, powered by generosity. A gift given freely by a star that asked nothing in return. And Bruce understood, sitting with that realization decades ago, that anything borrowed can be taken away. That knowledge became the seed of everything that followed. Not malice, not fear disguised as strategy, simply the quiet, unbearable weight of knowing something that could never be unknown. That the most powerful being Bruce had ever encountered was, in the end, still bound by rules. And where there are rules, however narrow, there is always a door. Bruce closed that section of the file the first time with a note at the bottom, written in ink slightly darker than the rest, as though pressed harder into the page by an unsteady hand. Understanding how to stop him is not the same as wanting to. I hope I never confuse the two. Reading it again tonight, Bruce allows himself a small, tired breath. He never did confuse the two, but he came close enough once to remember exactly how thin that line truly is. The third section of the file is thinner than the others, and Bruce has always found that strange, because it may be the most important part of the entire archive. It begins with a single sentence, underlined twice. Compassion is not a weakness. It is the only true limitation he has ever accepted willingly. Bruce remembers the night that sentence was written. It was after a joint operation, nothing extraordinary by League standards, a coordinated response to a meteor fragment threatening a populated coastline. Batman had calculated the trajectory with characteristic precision, recommending an approach that would neutralize the threat with total certainty, at the cost of a small, uninhabited research outpost positioned directly in the fragment's most efficient interception point. Superman refused. Not because the plan would fail. Bruce's plans rarely failed on paper. Superman refused because 3 researchers remained inside that outpost, delayed by equipment failure, and no amount of statistical efficiency could convince him to treat their presence as an acceptable variable to be optimized around. He found another way, a harder way, a way that required him to fly faster, push further, absorb more of the fragment's force directly than any calculation would have recommended, leaving him, afterward, uncharacteristically drained, resting in the quiet aftermath with a kind of exhaustion Bruce had rarely witnessed in him before. Bruce remembers asking him, once the danger had passed, why he chose the harder path when a simpler one existed. Clark's answer, delivered without hesitation, without performance, is recorded in Bruce's own handwriting on that thin page. Because the moment I start treating people as acceptable losses, Bruce, I stop being able to trust myself with any of this. The day this gets easy is the day someone needs to stop me. Bruce sat with that answer for a long time afterward. It became, in many ways, the philosophical center of everything he later built, because it revealed something Bruce had suspected but never heard confirmed so plainly, that Superman's mercy was not naivety. It was discipline, a conscious, constant choice, renewed in every single decision, to value even the smallest life as though it mattered as much as the largest crisis. This, Bruce understood, was Superman's true strength, more than any physical ability could ever be. And it was also, paradoxically, his greatest vulnerability. Not because it could be easily exploited, but because it meant he would always hesitate before causing harm, even when harm might have been the more efficient choice. An enemy without conscience calculates only outcomes. Superman calculated outcomes and consequences and cost, weighed against a moral framework so consistent that Bruce, after years of study, came to trust it more than he trusted most physical defenses he had ever built. Bruce recalls writing, on the final line of this section, a note that reads almost like a confession rather than a strategic observation. If I ever needed a contingency to succeed, it would not be because I outsmarted his strength. It would be because I understood his heart well enough to know exactly where its limits stood. And I would spend the rest of my life wishing I never had to use that knowledge. It is strange, Bruce thinks now, holding the brittle page beneath the soft desk lamp, how prophetic that sentence turned out to be. Kryptonian biology could be measured in laboratories, catalogued in spectral analysis, predicted through careful mathematics. But Clark's compassion could not be measured at all. It could only be witnessed, again and again, in small, quiet moments no textbook would ever record. A hand steadied under a fawning child, a voice softened for a grieving widow, a choice made harder simply because the easier choice would have cost someone else too much. Batman built an entire strategy around a variable that could not be quantified. He built it around trust. Not blind trust. Bruce has never been capable of anything so simple, but earned trust, tested across years of shared battles, quiet conversations, and moments where Clark had every opportunity to become something darker and chose, every single time, not to. That, Bruce reflects, closing the thin section gently, was the truest weapon in the entire file. Not kryptonite, not calculation, understanding. The fourth section of the folder is the thickest by far, and Bruce remembers why almost immediately upon opening it. Because it represents not one plan, but the graveyard of nearly 200 plans that came before the one that mattered. He spreads several pages across the desk, their edges soft with handling. Diagrams of solar suppression fields, later crossed out in red ink with the word unstable written beside them. Notes on synthetic kryptonite compounds, several variations, most abandoned after Bruce calculated the collateral radiation risk to nearby civilians as unacceptable. An entire page dedicated to a magnetic containment theory, discarded after Bruce realized it would require infrastructure large enough to be detected, and worse, misused, by anyone else who might someday find it. Bruce remembers those months as some of the loneliest of his life, though he rarely uses that word even in private thought. Every evening, after patrol, after league meetings where he sat across a table from Clark discussing budgets, threats, and shared strategies with total warmth and familiarity, Bruce would return to this cave and spend hours designing the exact means by which that same friend might one day need to be stopped. The dissonance never fully left him. He does not believe it ever should have. He remembers debating, seriously, whether to destroy the entire project more than once. There is a page, tucked slightly out of chronological order, dated nearly a year after the file began, that reads simply, "Reconsidering the ethics of this entire endeavor. Does preparing for his corruption make his corruption more likely? Am I building a self-fulfilling prophecy? Or am I building the only insurance a world without checks on absolute power can ever have?" Bruce remembers the answer he eventually settled on, though it never fully resolved the discomfort. He concluded that the danger was not in preparing. The danger would be in acting prematurely, in allowing suspicion to poison trust before trust had ever been broken. Preparation, kept sealed, unused, hidden even from the person it concerned, was not betrayal. It was responsibility. Because Bruce understood something few others in the League ever fully grasped. Power without oversight is not evil by nature, but it is always, eventually, a temptation toward tragedy. Not because Superman wanted control, because circumstances, grief, manipulation, or a single catastrophic mistake could someday place him in a position where control felt like the only remaining option. Bruce had seen that transformation happen to lesser men under far smaller pressures. He refused to assume Clark was immune simply because Clark was good. Goodness, Bruce had learned across a lifetime of losses, is not a permanent state. It is a daily choice, vulnerable to grief, to loss, to manipulation by those clever enough to exploit even the strongest heart's weakest hour. So he built the contingency not as an accusation against Clark's character, but as a form of stewardship, an acknowledgement that anyone entrusted with that much power deserved and needed an equal and opposite measure of accountability. Not to punish him, to protect the version of Clark that Bruce trusted from the version circumstances might someday force him to become. He recalls consulting no one during this stage, not even Alfred, not fully. The moral weight felt too personal to share, too dangerous to risk influencing another mind with his own uncertainty. He tested each plan against increasingly specific hypothetical scenarios: mind control, grief-driven rage, manipulation by an enemy capable of altering perception itself. Each scenario demanded different tools, different timing, different levels of intervention. Eventually, buried near the back of this thick section, a single plan remained standing after all others had been discarded. It did not rely on brute force, it relied on interruption. A narrow, carefully timed window in which physical vulnerability could be paired with psychological clarity, giving Clark himself the chance to regain control before anyone else needed to act on his behalf. Bruce remembers finishing that plan late one November evening, the cave silent except for the waterfall's endless murmur. He remembers not feeling victorious. He remembers feeling, more than anything else, quietly sad, The particular sadness of finishing something you never wanted to build in the first place, knowing that its very existence changes something permanent inside you. He closed the file that night and did not open it again for a long while. There is a persistent myth, Bruce reflects, turning to the 5th section of the folder, that kryptonite alone was ever capable of ending a confrontation with Superman. It is, in some ways, an understandable myth. Kryptonite is dramatic, visible, a glowing green fragment of a dead world, capable of stripping away strength with an almost theatrical cruelty. It photographs well, in the rare instances anyone photographs such things. It fits neatly into stories that prefer simple objects over complicated truths. But Bruce knows, more intimately than almost anyone alive, that kryptonite was never a plan. It was, at best, a single tool, narrow, temporary, and dangerously blunt. He remembers writing, early in this section, a warning to himself more than a strategic note. Kryptonite does not solve the problem. It only creates a moment. What happens within that moment is the only part that has ever mattered. A moment of weakened strength means nothing if it is wasted. A window of vulnerability, without precise understanding of what to do inside it, simply becomes cruelty without purpose. Pain inflicted on a friend, with no meaningful outcome beyond the pain itself. Bruce recalls with quiet discomfort even now an early version of himself who might have believed otherwise. A younger, more paranoid Bruce Wayne who, in the aftermath of certain betrayals by other allies, briefly considered kryptonite alone as sufficient insurance. He is grateful, looking back, that Alfred challenged that assumption directly, one of the few times Alfred ever intervened so bluntly in Bruce's private research. A stone that hurts your friend is not a plan, Master Wayne, Alfred had said, standing exactly where Bruce now sits, arms folded, voice quieter than usual, but no less firm for it. It is merely a weapon, waiting for someone worse than you to find a better use for it. Bruce remembers that conversation shaping the entire philosophy of the file from that point forward. Kryptonite, he decided, would never be the centerpiece of any contingency. It would exist only as one variable among many, a tool to create opportunity, never a solution in itself. The real answer, Bruce came to understand across years of refinement, was always going to be built from 3 things far harder to acquire than any radioactive fragment. Preparation, understanding exactly when and how a critical moment might arise, long before it ever did. Timing, recognizing that the smallest window, seized with precision, mattered more than overwhelming force applied carelessly. And trust, the belief, tested repeatedly across years of shared battles, that whatever intervention became necessary, would alternatives be received by Clark not as an attack, but as an act of care, however difficult that distinction might be to communicate in the heat of an actual crisis. Bruce remembers writing, near the end of this section, the sentence he considers now, all these years later, to be the truest summary of everything File represents. The weapon was never kryptonite. The weapon was understanding him well enough to know that if the moment ever came, he would want to be stopped as much as I would want to stop him. He sits with that thought for a long moment beneath the soft hum of the desk lamp, rain still tracing quiet rhythms somewhere far above him. It is, he realizes, the sentence that has always mattered most in this entire archive, more than any diagram, any calculation, any carefully rehearsed contingency. Not a stone, a conviction, held quietly between 2 people who trusted each other enough to imagine the worst and prepare for it together, without ever needing to say so aloud. The sixth section of the folder is not filled with diagrams or calculations at all. It is filled with questions Bruce asked himself late at night, in handwriting that grows visibly less steady the further the pages progress. He finds one, dated during a particularly difficult stretch of that year, that reads, "Does the mere existence of this file make me guilty of the very distrust I claim to be guarding against? If Clark ever discovered this, would he see caution, or would he see betrayal? And if he saw betrayal, would he be wrong?" Bruce remembers writing that question during one of the loneliest periods of his adult life. Not lonely in circumstance, surrounded as he always was by allies, by Alfred, by a growing family of protégés who each, in their own way, depended on him. Lonely in the specific, unshareable weight of carrying a secret about someone he cared for deeply. A secret that, if revealed carelessly, could unravel one of the few friendships in his life built on something close to unguarded warmth. Bruce has never been a man who forms friendships easily. His life, from the moment 2 gunshots rewired everything he understood about safety, has been organized around distance, controlled proximity, carefully managed vulnerability, relationships kept at an arm's length precisely long enough to protect both parties from the inevitable disappointment Bruce has, at his core, always expected. Clark was different. Clark had, almost from their earliest interactions, refused to accept the distance Bruce instinctively offered. He asked Bruce personal questions no one else dared ask. He remembered small details about Bruce's life that even some of Bruce's closest allies overlooked. The anniversary of his parents' deaths, observed quietly each year with nothing more than a short, gentle message that never demanded a response. He treated Bruce's guardedness not as a wall to respect from a distance, but as a language to be patiently learned. The way one might learn to understand a person who speaks softly, by simply choosing to listen more carefully. Bruce, in turn, had come to consider Clark one of the only people alive who saw both Batman and Bruce Wayne as the same whole person, rather than 2 separate tools serving 2 separate purposes, which made the file almost unbearable to continue building some nights. He remembers one entry in particular, written in unusually small handwriting, as though Bruce himself had wanted to make the words difficult to reread. "If I never need this file, I will have spent months preparing to betray the trust of someone who has only ever offered me honesty. If I never build this file, and I am wrong about him even once, an entire world will pay a price no apology could ever repair. I do not know which failure I could live with less." Bruce remembers reading that now, the specific ache of that period. Not fear of Superman, but fear of what preparing for Superman revealed about the limits of Bruce's own capacity for trust. He eventually resolved the conflict, not through certainty, but through humility. He accepted that the file was not proof he distrusted Clark. It was proof he distrusted certainty itself. The seductive, dangerous belief that any person, however good, however careful, could be guaranteed immune to every possible future. Bruce had learned, across a lifetime of losses, that the moment you assume someone is beyond the need for accountability is the exact moment tragedy finds its opening. The file was never built because Bruce believed Clark would fall. It was built because Bruce refused to bet the entire world on the belief that he wouldn't. That distinction, thin as it may seem from the outside, became the quiet, moral spine that allowed Bruce to keep working night after night without losing the friendship he valued more than he ever let himself admit. Even to the pages of a file no one else was ever meant to read. The 7th section of the folder is the shortest, though Bruce remembers the night it describes as the longest of his life. He does not need the pages in front of him to recall it. The memory has never required paper to remain vivid, but he turns them anyway, slowly, because there is a comfort in seeing his own handwriting confirm that what he remembers actually happened, and was not simply the shape of an old nightmare. It began, as these things often do, not with a declaration of villainy, but with grief. A manipulation, precise and cruel, engineered by an enemy who understood, as Bruce himself understood, that the fastest way to break someone as strong as Clark was never through force. It was through loss, carefully staged to look real, calibrated exactly to overwhelm judgment with pain. For a period of hours that felt, to everyone involved, far longer than the clock ever confirmed, Clark was not fully himself. His actions grew erratic. His restraint, the very quality Bruce had spent years studying and trusting, began to fracture under a grief so total it briefly convinced him the world itself had wronged him beyond forgiveness. Bruce remembers the specific quality of dread he felt that night. Not the sharp adrenaline of ordinary danger, but something colder, slower. The particular horror of watching a friend disappear behind pain he did not choose and could not, in that moment, escape alone. He remembers thinking, with unusual clarity for a man usually consumed by calculation in moments of crisis, this is not an enemy. This is Clark, drowning. The rest of the league, understandably, prepared for confrontation. Diana moved with quiet resolve, prepared to do whatever became necessary. Others readied contingencies of their own, each built from their own understanding of Superman's power and their own fears of what unchecked strength might do to a grieving world. Bruce did something different. He did not lead with force. He led with the years of study contained inside this very folder, the understanding that Clark's compassion, however buried beneath grief, had never actually disappeared. It had only been overwhelmed. Bruce's plan, refined across years of quiet nights exactly like this one, was never designed to defeat Clark. It was designed to interrupt him, to create one small, precise moment where physical vulnerability met psychological clarity, giving the real Clark, the one Bruce had studied so carefully for years, the smallest possible opening to resurface from beneath the pain controlling him. Bruce remembers the details with unusual precision. A synthetic compound, calibrated with narrow specificity rather than brute force, deployed not to cause suffering, but to create exactly the kind of momentary clarity a mind in crisis desperately needs. A location chosen carefully, away from innocent bystanders, chosen months earlier during quiet planning sessions that felt, at the time, almost absurdly theoretical. A single sentence, prepared in advance, rehearsed privately more times than Bruce has ever admitted to anyone, meant to be spoken at exactly the right moment. Not a threat, but an anchor. He remembers speaking it. Clark, this isn't them. This is you. Come back. He remembers Clark's eyes for just a moment changing, the wildness receding, replaced by something achingly familiar, something that looked, more than anything else, like a man waking from the worst dream of his life to find a friend had stayed beside him the entire time, waiting. Bruce does not linger on the physical details of that night when he remembers it now. The strategy mattered less in the end than the outcome. Clark did not need to be defeated. He needed to be reached. And because Bruce had spent years studying not Superman's limits, but Clark's heart, he knew exactly how to build a bridge back to him, rather than a wall against him. That, Bruce reflects quietly now, closing the section, was the true purpose the entire contingency had always served. Not a weapon aimed at an enemy, but a rope thrown toward a friend standing at the edge of himself in the one moment he could not throw it to himself alone. The 8th section of the folder contains no diagrams, no calculations, no strategic notes at all. It contains a single, folded letter, the paper soft from having been opened and closed more times than Bruce could ever count. He opens it now, carefully, the way one might open something fragile enough to tear from memory alone. The conversation, it describes, happened 2 days after that night, once Clark had rested, once the grief that had briefly consumed him had been properly understood, mourned, and metabolized into something survivable rather than something devouring. Bruce remembers requesting the meeting himself, something he rarely did, preferring instead to let others come to him on his own carefully controlled terms. This time, he went to Clark. They met not in the watchtower, not in the Batcave, but in a quiet field outside Smallville, at Clark's request. Ordinary grass beneath an ordinary sky, the kind of unremarkable place Bruce suspected Clark chose deliberately, wanting the conversation to happen somewhere far removed from capes, cowls, or the weight either identity carried. Bruce remembers telling him everything, not vaguely, not diplomatically softened for comfort. Everything. The years of study, the discarded plans, the kryptonite variations considered and rejected, the specific compound used 2 nights earlier. The sentence rehearsed in private more times than Bruce would ever admit to anyone else. He remembers his own voice, unusually unsteady, explaining that the file had existed for years, hidden from everyone, including Clark himself. He remembers waiting for anger, bracing for it, the way he had braced for enemy attacks his entire adult life, expecting betrayal to land like a physical blow. It did not come. Clark listened, quietly, the way Bruce had noticed him listen to grieving witnesses years earlier. Full attention, no interruption. Patience that seemed to stretch time itself into something gentler. When Bruce finished, Clark was quiet for a long moment, looking out over the field rather than at Bruce directly, as though giving them both space to absorb what had just been said. Then Clark said something Bruce has carried with him every day since, something he wrote down that same night, word for word, in handwriting steadier than anything else in this entire file. Bruce, if you hadn't built that plan, I think I would have been more afraid of you than I've ever been of anyone. Not because you prepared for the worst version of me, because if you hadn't, it would mean you never took the responsibility of my power as seriously as I try to. Bruce remembers being unable to respond immediately. He remembers the specific silence of that field, wind moving gently through tall grass, sunlight catching on Clark's shoulders in a way that made him look, for just a moment, less like an icon and more like a tired, grateful man. Clark continued, quietly. I've thought about it myself, you know. What I'd want someone to do, if I ever lost myself the way I almost did 2 nights ago. I never had the courage to build the plan. I'm grateful you did. That doesn't mean it didn't hurt to hear about it, but hurt and betrayal aren't the same thing, Bruce. You didn't betray me. You protected the person I'm trying to be, from the person I'm afraid I could become. Bruce remembers asking him, carefully, whether their friendship could survive the file's existence now that it had been revealed. Clark's answer is written at the very bottom of the letter, in Bruce's own hand, transcribed that same evening while the words were still fresh enough to feel almost audible. Bruce, our friendship isn't built on you never preparing for the worst in me. It's built on you never assuming the worst was inevitable. There's a difference. I've always known which one you chose. Bruce sits with that memory now, the folded letter resting gently in his hands, rain still murmuring somewhere far above the quiet cave. He remembers realizing in that field years ago that the true victory had never been the successful intervention 2 nights earlier. It had been this conversation. The fact that trust, tested in the most painful way either of them could imagine, had not broken. It had deepened. The 9th section of the folder is brief, but Bruce has always considered it one of the most important, because it answers the question he suspects most people, hearing this story second-hand, would never think to ask. Why did Clark accept it? Not merely tolerate it, the way one tolerates an uncomfortable truth for the sake of peace. Accept it, fully, without lingering resentment, in a way that allowed their friendship not just to survive, but to grow into something even more honest than before. Bruce has turned this question over many times across the years, and the answer he always returns to is written plainly near the top of this section, in handwriting far calmer than most of the rest of the file. Because Clark has always understood something most people never fully grasp about power, that the version of strength worth trusting is the version that welcomes accountability, not the version that resents it. Bruce remembers a conversation sometime after the field, after the letter, after the wound between them had genuinely begun to heal rather than simply scar over. They were standing together on the watchtower observation deck, Earth turning slowly and silently below them, and Bruce had asked Clark, almost hesitantly, why he had never once, in all the years they had known each other, tried to place any similar safeguard on Bruce's own considerable resources, technology, and influence. Clark's answer surprised him. I have thought about it, Bruce, believe me. You've built weapons that terrify me more than some entire armies I've faced, but I never built a file on you the way you built one on me. Because I always believed you'd build the safeguard against yourself before anyone else needed to. You already carry so much weight questioning your own choices that I've never worried you'd stop questioning them. Bruce remembers being struck, quietly, by the fairness of that observation, an acknowledgement that accountability does not always require external structure. Sometimes it lives inside a person's own relentless self-examination, the same restless conscience that had kept Bruce awake through countless nights just like this one, questioning every choice long after the choice had already been made. But Clark continued, and this is the part Bruce considers the true heart of this section. Still, I'm glad you built it anyway, Bruce. Not because I doubted myself, but because I know how easy it would be for someone with my power to start believing they were above ever needing to be questioned. The moment I stop welcoming accountability is the moment I actually become dangerous. You didn't just prepare a plan to stop me. You built a mirror I never would have had otherwise. Something that forced me to keep asking myself the same question you were always asking about me. Am I still someone worth trusting with this much power? Bruce sits with those words now, in the quiet hum of the cave, understanding them more fully than he perhaps ever did in the moment they were first spoken. The contingency, in the end, had never functioned as a threat hanging silently over their friendship. It had functioned as a form of mutual respect, an acknowledgement shared between two men who each carried extraordinary burdens, that neither of them should ever be allowed to consider themselves beyond question. Not Clark because of his power, not Bruce because of his intellect and resources. Superman understood the contingency because Superman had always understood something Bruce sometimes forgot to grant himself credit for believing: that true strength is not the absence of limitation, it is the willing acceptance of it. That mutual understanding, forged not in the moment of crisis, but in the quiet, difficult conversation that followed it, became the true foundation upon which their friendship continued to grow for every year that followed. The missing page. It is here, closing the 9th section, that Bruce notices, as he has noticed every time he has opened this file across the years, that something is missing. The file was never meant to end at 9 sections. Bruce remembers, with the particular clarity that surrounds memories we have tried and failed to forget, that there was once a 10th entry within this very section, a page detailing one final contingency, the most extreme of all the plans Bruce had ever designed, a permanent solution. A plan built not for interruption, not for temporary vulnerability, but for absolute, irreversible certainty. He remembers writing it late one night during the darkest stretch of his research, in a state of exhaustion and fear he is not proud of revisiting. He remembers, less clearly, removing it. The page has been gone for years. Bruce has searched for it more than once, quietly, in idle moments, wondering if it had been misfiled, lost, destroyed by accident. He never found it. And some nights, sitting exactly where he sits now, he has wondered whether the missing page represented something he simply could not bring himself to remember writing at all. Tonight, as if summoned by the question itself, soft footsteps echo faintly from the cave's upper stairwell. Alfred descends slowly, a tray in hand. 2 cups of tea steaming gently in the cool cave air, exactly as he has done on countless nights like this one. He sets the tray down beside the folder, without needing to ask what Bruce is reading. He has always known. "You looking for the page again?" Alfred says quietly, not a question. Bruce looks up, saying nothing, which is answer enough. Alfred settles into the chair beside him, hands folded, the way he does when he intends to say something he has waited a long time to say. "You removed it yourself, Master Wayne, nearly 9 years ago. I remember because you asked me to witness the act, though you never told me what was written on it." Bruce turns slightly. "I don't remember asking that." "You were rather tired that night," Alfred says gently. "You had just returned from Smallville." Bruce is quiet for a long moment. "You burned it," Alfred continues softly, "in the small fireplace upstairs, the one in the study your father used to sit beside. You said very little, only that some contingencies should never survive contact with the people they were built for, that some plans, once no longer needed, deserve to disappear entirely, rather than risk ever tempting a lesser version of yourself to use them." Alfred pauses, watching Bruce carefully. "You told me the page described a way to end things permanently, Master Wayne. No interruption, no mercy, no possibility of the very reconciliation you eventually found with him in that field. You said you had built it in a moment you weren't proud of, during your darkest hour of doubting whether trust alone would ever be enough. And after the field, Alfred says, quieter now, after that conversation, after you understood him, truly understood him, you decided that page no longer deserved to exist. Not because the danger it addressed had disappeared entirely, but because you finally believed, without needing the fallback of absolute certainty, that trust could carry the weight instead. Bruce sits in silence for a long moment, the folder open before him, the missing space where that final page once lived, somehow more present in its absence than any of the pages that remain. I chose trust over certainty, Bruce says quietly, almost to himself. You did, Alfred agrees. It is, I believe, the single bravest decision I have ever watched you make, Master Wayne. Braver than any night you've spent in that cowl. Bruce sits with that memory for a long while after Alfred returns upstairs, the tea cooling untouched beside him, rain still falling somewhere above the quiet stone ceiling of the cave. He understands now why he has never remembered the missing page as clearly as everything else in this file. Not because his memory failed him, but because he had chosen, deliberately, to let that particular certainty go, to release the version of the plan that would have removed all risk by removing all trust along with it. A permanent solution, Bruce reflects, is not a triumph of preparation. It is a failure of faith. A decision to protect the world by assuming the very worst about someone who had, in every meaningful moment that mattered, proven himself worthy of something better than assumption. Bruce had built that page during his darkest hour, when doubt outweighed everything he had learned about Clark's character, and he had destroyed it during his clearest one, once that conversation in the Smallville field reminded him what the entire file had always actually been about. Not defeating Superman. Understanding Clark. Bruce gathers the remaining pages now, gently, careful with the old paper, the way one is careful with something sacred rather than merely classified. He aligns the edges, closes the worn leather cover, and holds the folder for a long moment in the quiet gold light of the desk lamp. He thinks of every version of this plan that came before the final one, the discarded solar suppression theories, the magnetic containment failures, the countless synthetic compounds tested and abandoned. He thinks of the thick section built from nearly 200 failed attempts, each one teaching him something new about restraint, about the difference between preparation and paranoia. He thinks of Clark's voice in that field, steady and kind, despite everything that had happened only 2 days earlier. You didn't betray me. You protected the person I'm trying to be, from the person I'm afraid I could become. He thinks of the missing page, gone to ash in an upstairs fireplace 9 years ago, and understands now that its absence was never a gap in the file at all. It was the file's true conclusion. Bruce rises slowly from the chair, the folder resting gently in both hands, and walks back through the quiet stone corridor toward the vault. The 7 locks await him in the same order they always have: heartbeat, voice, key, and the 4 quieter safeguards known only to him. One by one they release, The heavy door groans softly open, dust drifting once more in the pale light. He places the folder back on its small, elevated shelf, exactly where it has rested for years, apart from every other file in this vast archive of secrets. He does not close the vault immediately. He stands there a moment longer, looking at the black leather cover, the faint pressed symbol of the House of L catching the dim light one final time. "I hope you never need to be opened again," Bruce says quietly, to no one, to the folder, to himself, to the years of doubt and care contained within it. Not because the plan failed, because the world it was built to protect should never require it. He closes the vault door. The locks re-engage in reverse order, sealing the chamber once more in silence, in darkness, in the particular stillness reserved for things too important to be disturbed carelessly. Bruce turns and walks back toward the main chamber of the cave, footsteps echoing softly against ancient stone, the distant waterfall continuing its endless quiet conversation exactly as it always has. By the time Bruce reaches the upper chamber, the rain outside has finally begun to soften, thinning into a gentle mist that clings to the windows rather than beating against them. The Bat computer's monitors remain dark, returned fully to standby, its quiet hum the only sound accompanying the waterfall now. Bruce sets the 2 cooled cups of tea Alfred left behind onto a small tray, and for a moment simply stands still in the space between the cave's deep stone silence and the pale grey light beginning to gather somewhere far above the manor grounds. He thinks, one final time, about the shape of everything he reviewed tonight, not as separate chapters of strategy, but as one continuous, unbroken thread. Understanding a man before studying his powers, accepting that some problems cannot be solved through force alone, learning that compassion, far from being a weakness, is often the sturdiest structure a soul can be built upon, building contingencies not from suspicion, but from responsibility, choosing, in the end, trust over certainty, even when certainty would have felt so much safer. Bruce walks slowly toward the cave's wide entrance, where a soft grey light has begun spilling gently across the ancient stone floor, chasing away the last shadows of the long night. He steps out beneath the overhang, feeling the cool morning air against his face for the first time in hours. Rain finally reduced to a faint drizzle that seems almost reluctant to end. Somewhere far above him, breaking gently through the retreating grey clouds, a distant streak of movement crosses the brightening sky. Small, quick, gone again within seconds, headed toward some quiet corner of the world that needed help before sunrise fully arrived. Bruce watches it for a long moment. He smiles, faintly, tiredly, in the particular way of a man who has spent the entire night revisiting his own conscience and found, somehow, that it held. Not because Superman was ever defeated, because Superman is still there, still choosing every single day the harder path over the easier one, still trusting Bruce enough to know that somewhere beneath Wayne Manor, locked behind 7 careful safeguards, an old black folder waits quietly in the dark, not as a threat, but as a promise. A promise that the world's greatest power would never go unquestioned, and a promise, just as important, that the friendship built alongside that power would never be treated carelessly either. Bruce turns back toward the cave, footsteps unhurried now, the weight of the night finally beginning to loosen from his shoulders the way it always does with the arrival of dawn. The waterfall continues its quiet, endless rhythm behind him. The Bat computer waits, patient, dark, ready for whatever tomorrow requires. And somewhere above Gotham, above Metropolis, above every quiet corner of a world neither of them ever stopped protecting, two men who once prepared for each other's worst continue, instead, to simply trust each other's best. The cave falls silent. Morning has come. And for tonight, at least, there is nothing left to prepare for. Only the quiet, hard-won peace of a promise successfully kept.